My son called me at 11:42 p.m. and said he was sitting on the floor outside a hospital stairwell with his daughter because security had asked them not to take up a chair. He kept apologizing, not for what happened, for breathing too loud. His wedding ring was in his coat pocket, wrapped in a discharge bracelet that wasn't his. I told him to stay where he was. They thought this was the end of him. They were wrong. My son called me at 11:42 p.m. I remember the time because I was standing in my kitchen, rinsing a single coffee mug I hadn't used, listening to the house settle the way it does when you live alone long enough. His name lit up my phone, and for half a second I thought about letting it ring. Not because I didn't want to answer, but because something in my chest tightened before I even picked up. He didn't say hello. He said, "Mom, I don't know where to go." I have. There was a hollow echo behind his voice, the kind you only hear in places that aren't meant for conversation. Stairwells, garages, emergency corridors. I asked him where he was, and he told me he was sitting on the floor outside a hospital stairwell because security had asked them not to block the hallway. He said it like it was a reasonable request, like he was the one inconveniencing someone. I asked who them was. "Me and Lily," he said, and then corrected himself. "She's asleep, kind of. She keeps waking up." I closed my eyes. Lily was my granddaughter, 13 years old. Too old to be carried, too young to pretend things didn't hurt. "What happened?" I asked. There was a pause, long enough that I could hear the hum of fluorescent lights through the phone. Then he started apologizing, not for leaving, not for calling me so late. He apologized for breathing too loud earlier when a nurse walked past. He apologized for not thinking ahead. He apologized for everything except the one thing that mattered, which told me exactly how deep this went. I told him to slow down. He told me they'd been asked to leave the house that afternoon. Not asked, exactly. Informed. His wife's father had come over with a man from her firm's legal department. Papers were already printed. A termination letter from his job. Effective immediately. A notice of separation. A temporary custody arrangement he hadn't seen before that moment. He said it all happened in under an hour, like it was a meeting he hadn't prepared for. They said it was cleaner this way, he told me. More professional. Professional. That word landed wrong. He said Lily had gone to her room to get her backpack, and when she came back, the locks on the doors had already been changed. Her shoes were still inside. Her math book was on the kitchen table. Someone had placed their coats in a black trash bag and set it by the garage like they were taking out something spoiled. I asked him why they were at the hospital. "She had an asthma attack," he said quietly. "Nothing serious. They treated her and discharged her. I didn't know where else to sit." I looked around my kitchen, at the clean counters and the quiet, at the life I'd built after years of learning how to stand without leaning on anyone. I picked up my keys. "Stay where you are," I said. "I'm coming." He tried to protest. He always did. He said the drive was too long. He said it was late. He said he didn't want to be a problem. I cut him off with a tone I hadn't used since he was a teenager and thought he could handle everything himself. "I'm coming," I said again. When I arrived, I knew I was in the right place before I saw him. Hospitals have a smell you don't forget. A mix of disinfectant and fatigue. I followed the sound of my own footsteps down a stairwell and found them sitting on the landing between floors, backs against the wall. Lily's head was resting on his shoulder. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He was holding her inhaler like it might disappear if he let go. His wedding ring wasn't on his finger. It was in his coat pocket, wrapped in a hospital discharge bracelet that wasn't his. I noticed that before he noticed me, he looked up when I said his name. His face crumpled in a way that made something sharp twist inside me, but I didn't rush him. I didn't reach out right away. I'd learned a long time ago that panic doesn't help people who are already drowning. I crouched in front of Lily and brushed a strand of hair off her forehead. She stirred and opened her eyes, confused, then focused on my face. "Grandma?" she whispered. "Yes, sweetheart," I said. "I'm here." She nodded like that, explained everything, and closed her eyes again. My son finally spoke. "I messed up." "No," I said calmly. "You were targeted." He shook his head, already conditioned to disagree. They said there were discrepancies, that I wasn't aligned with the organization's values, that I put them at risk. I didn't ask what kind of discrepancies. I didn't need to. I'd spent my career watching people weaponize language like that. Words designed to sound neutral while they dismantle you piece by piece. We left the hospital quietly. No drama, no confrontation. I signed the discharge papers with a steady hand and led them out through the side exit, the one most people don't notice. The parking lot was nearly empty. Lily slept the whole way to the car. During the drive, my son stared straight ahead, like the road was the only thing keeping him upright. He kept explaining, filling the silence with justification. He said he'd followed every protocol. He said he'd raised concerns internally. He said he never thought they'd do this. They said I embarrassed them, he said finally, in front of donors. That was the first honest sentence he'd said all night. We drove for a long time. He didn't ask where we were going. He trusted me enough not to. That trust had been built slowly, over years of watching me survive things I never talked about. When we pulled into my driveway, the house was dark except for the porch light I always left on. I helped Lily inside and set her up in the guest room, the one with the extra blankets and the old bookshelf she loved. She woke just long enough to ask if she had school the next day. Not tomorrow, I said. Tomorrow you rest. She accepted that and fell asleep with her shoes still on. My son stood in the hallway, hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked smaller than I remembered. I don't know what I'm going to do, he said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw what they'd already taken. Not his job, not his house, his certainty, his sense of reality. You don't need to know tonight, I said. Tonight, you sleep. After he went to bed, I sat alone at my dining table. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I opened my laptop and pulled up a blank document, the kind I used to start with when something needed to be untangled carefully. I typed a single name, the name of the nonprofit board that had signed his termination letter. Then I typed another, and another. By the time the sun started to come up, I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. They believed they had erased my son quietly, cleanly, with paperwork and polite language. They believed no one would question it, because questioning them had consequences. They were right about one thing. Everything my son believed to be true was about to collapse, just not the way they expected. By morning, the house had settled into a fragile quiet. Lily was still asleep, sprawled diagonally across the guest bed, one arm thrown over a pillow like she was holding on to something. My son sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee he hadn't touched, staring at the condensation ring it was leaving on the wood. I'd already been awake for hours. There are moments when people think power announces itself. Titles, offices, press releases. I learned early on that real power prefers to stay unlisted. It works in margins and footnotes, in policies no one reads until they're suddenly ruined by them. I didn't tell my son that yet. Instead, I asked him to walk me through everything again, slowly this time, not emotionally, chronologically, dates, names, who spoke first, who handed him what. He hesitated, then nodded. He'd always been good at following instructions when they were clear. He told me his wife's father had arrived just after lunch. No warning, no raised voice. The man wore a navy blazer like he was heading to a board meeting, not ending a marriage. With him was a woman from the firm's Risk Oversight Division. She never introduced herself by name, just her function. They sat at the dining table and slid papers across the surface like a routine transaction. A termination notice citing ethical irregularities. A memo alleging unauthorized data access. A temporary custody filing already stamped by a clerk he didn't recognize. They said it was better this way, my son said. Less mess. I nodded once and made a note. What did your wife say? I asked. He looked down. She didn't look at me. She just said her parents were handling it. That told me more than anything else. After he finished, I asked him one more question. Did you sign anything? No, he said quickly. They asked me to, but I said I wanted to review it first. Good. That was very good. I stood, rinsed his untouched mug, and set it back in the cabinet. Then I went to my office, the small room at the back of the house that most people assumed was just a place I paid bills. I closed the door and sat down at my desk. On the wall was nothing impressive, no degrees, no plaques, just a single framed document that most people wouldn't recognize for what it was. I hadn't hung it for pride. I'd hung it to remember exactly how much leverage could fit on one piece of paper. For 32 years, I'd worked in regulatory compliance. Not the kind that shows up in headlines, but the kind that shapes entire industries without ever being mentioned. I helped write oversight frameworks for federal grant programs. I designed audit structures nonprofits depended on to keep their funding. I sat in rooms where people decided which violations were forgiven and which were fatal. And then, when I was done, I stepped away quietly. I made one phone call. The man who answered hadn't spoken to me in almost 6 years. He didn't need an explanation. "I need a favor," I said. He laughed softly. "That's not why you're calling. I need access," I corrected, to public oversight filings connected to a specific nonprofit consortium. There was a pause. "You're not on the books anymore." "I know," I said, "but the framework is still mine." Another pause, longer this time. "Send me the name," he said. I sent it. Then I waited. While I waited, I logged into an old database most people forgot existed. It tracked compliance revisions across grant cycles. Dry material, boring, unless you knew what to look for. By noon, I had the first crack in the story they'd built. The complaint against my son hadn't originated with his employer. It had been routed through an external ethics advisory panel tied to the same nonprofit board his father-in-law chaired. The language was polished. Too polished. It used terminology that had been retired 2 revisions ago. That meant whoever wrote it wasn't current. Or worse, they were recycling. I printed the document and laid it flat on my desk. Then I pulled the termination letter beside it. Same sentence structure, same phrasing, same passive constructions designed to sound objective while assigning blame. This wasn't an investigation. It was a template. My phone rang. "Give me a minute." The man on the other end said, "I'm pulling something you didn't ask for, but I think you'll want to see it." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. An hour later, an encrypted file appeared in my inbox. Inside were 3 previous ethics complaints filed over the last 7 years. Different names, different states, same nonprofit network, same board members, different victims, same outcome. Careers ended, credentials suspended, families displaced. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. This wasn't a family protecting their daughter. This was a system protecting itself. When Lily woke up, she came into the kitchen quietly and sat at the counter, swinging her legs. She asked if she could have cereal for lunch. "Of course," I said, and poured it myself. She watched me for a moment, then said, "Mom said Dad did something bad." I kept my voice even. "Your mom is wrong." She nodded slowly, like she was filing that away. "Am I bad?" she asked. I set the milk down and looked at her. "No." She seemed satisfied with that and went back to eating. My son stood in the doorway, listening. His eyes were red, but steadier than they'd been the night before. "I don't understand how they did this so fast," he said. "They didn't," I replied. "They planned it." That afternoon, I drove to a storage unit on the edge of town. Inside were boxes I hadn't opened in years. Old binders, archived files, the kind of material you keep when you know the rules will eventually be broken again. I carried one box back to the car. It was heavier than it looked. By the time I returned home, I had confirmation from 2 different sources. The nonprofit board tied to my son's dismissal had quietly settled multiple complaints over the years, not against their staff, against people who challenged them. Whistleblowers, internal auditors, spouses who knew too much. My son hadn't embarrassed them. He'd refused to look away. That evening, after Lily went to bed, my son sat across from me at the dining table. "I keep thinking if I'd just kept my mouth shut," he said. I leaned forward. Then this would have happened later, to someone else, or to Lily. He went quiet. They believe you're isolated, I continued, that you'll be too ashamed to fight, that you'll accept their version of events because it's easier than questioning everything. He swallowed hard. And if they're right? They aren't, I said calmly, because they forgot something. What? I folded my hands on the table. They forgot who raised you. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and something in his expression shifted. Not hope, not relief, recognition. They think they've already won, he said slowly. Yes, I said, and that's exactly where I need them. I stood and turned off the lights, leaving the room in shadow. Somewhere across the city, his father-in-law was probably congratulating himself on how cleanly it had all been handled, on how quickly my son had been removed from the board, from the house, from the narrative. He believed the story was finished. It had barely begun. The formal accusation arrived the next morning. It didn't come by mail. It didn't come through a lawyer. It arrived as an email sent simultaneously to my son, his former employer, 2 licensing boards, and a professional association he'd belonged to since graduate school. It was labeled Notice of Ethical Review and written in the careful, antiseptic language people use when they want to sound impartial while drawing blood. My son forwarded it to me without comment. I read it once, then again more slowly. Unauthorized access to protected datasets, breach of donor confidentiality, conduct unbecoming of a fiduciary role. Each allegation stood on its own, but together they painted a picture of recklessness and dishonesty that didn't belong to the man I knew. At the bottom was the line that mattered most. Pending review, all professional credentials are provisionally suspended. That was the kill shot. Without those credentials, my son couldn't work in his field. He couldn't consult, teach, or even volunteer in related capacities. The suspension wasn't permanent, but it didn't need to be. In most cases, the damage was already done by the time anyone admitted a mistake. My son sat across from me, his hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone white. They're saying I accessed files I never even had permission to see, he said. I wouldn't even know how. I know, I replied. He kept talking, voice tight. They're saying donors complained, that they felt unsafe, that I violated trust. I closed the laptop and looked at him. Did anyone ever say this to you directly? No, he said. Not once. Did anyone ask for an explanation? No. Did anyone interview you? No. That was the point. Reviews like this weren't designed to uncover truth. They were designed to justify outcomes that had already been decided. By noon, the calls started. A former colleague left a voicemail, apologetic but distant, saying he hoped everything would work out. Another sent a short text advising him to focus on family for now. His department chair sent a formal note stating they would need to reevaluate future collaboration. Each message was polite. Each one put a little more distance between him and the life he'd built. That afternoon, Lily came home from school with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before. They pulled me out of class, she said, sitting down at the kitchen table. The counselor asked if I felt safe. I looked at her. What did you say? I said yes, she replied. But she kept looking at me like I was lying. That was how it started. Institutions rarely went after children directly. They let concern do the work for them. Later that evening, my son's phone buzzed again. This time, it was his wife. He answered on speaker, his hands shaking slightly as he set the phone on the table. We need to talk about Lily, she said. Her voice was calm, practiced. I want to see her, he replied. That's complicated right now, she said. Given everything that's come out. Nothing has come out, he said. Allegations aren't facts. There was a pause, then her father's voice joined the call, as if he'd been waiting just out of frame. We're trying to protect her, he said. From instability. I leaned back in my chair and listened. Instability? My son repeated. You threw us out of the house. You're staying with your mother, the man replied. That's not exactly a permanent solution. I spoke then. my voice steady and measured. "This is my home, and Lily is safe here." End quote. There was a brief silence on the line, the kind that comes when someone realizes they've miscalculated. "This is a family matter," the man said finally. "No," I replied. "It's a procedural one now." The line went dead. Within an hour, a revised custody filing appeared in my son's inbox. Temporary restrictions, supervised visitation pending review, a clause citing ongoing ethical investigations as grounds for concern. They were moving fast, too fast. I spent the evening cross-referencing timestamps, the ethics notice, the custody filing, the termination letter. They all referenced the same internal report, the same document number, the same review committee. That committee hadn't met in over 8 months. I confirmed it through an archived meeting schedule buried in a public transparency portal. No quorum, no agenda, no minutes. Yet somehow, it had generated a full investigative finding overnight. This wasn't negligence. It was fabrication. At 9:17 p.m., my secure email chimed again. This time, the sender didn't hide behind anonymity. "I think they did this to me, too." The message was short. No greeting, no explanation. Attached was a scanned letter dated 5 years earlier, bearing the same letterhead as my son's ethics notice. Different name, same accusations, same phrasing. I stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. "Can you talk?" The response came immediately. "Yes, I've been waiting." We spoke for nearly 2 hours. The woman was in her early 40s, living in a different state now, working outside the field she'd trained for. She told me how she'd been labeled a risk, quietly removed from her position, and advised not to contest the findings for her own good. "They said fighting would only make it worse," she said, "that people like us don't win these things." "What happened when you asked for evidence?" I asked. She laughed softly. "They said the evidence was confidential." After we hung up, I sat alone in my office and pulled the 2 notices up side by side. I didn't need advanced software to see it. They were nearly identical. I printed them both and laid them on my desk. 2 lives disrupted. 2 careers derailed. One pattern emerging. My son knocked lightly on the doorframe. "They emailed again," he said. This time, the message was from the licensing board. "Failure to cooperate may result in permanent revocation." "They're daring me to respond," he said, "to defend myself." "They're daring you to legitimize the process," I replied. He looked at me, eyes tired. "What do we do?" I slid the papers into a folder and stood. "We don't argue with a system designed to erase you. We document it." That night, as the house went quiet, I made a list. Names, dates, committees, funding sources, boards that overlapped where they shouldn't. I followed the trail the way I always had, not emotionally, but methodically. Somewhere in that web of nonprofits and oversight panels was the truth they were trying to bury. They believed they could overwhelm us with speed, with authority, with the weight of institutions that seemed too large to challenge. They didn't know I had helped build those institutions, and I remembered exactly where their weak points were. By the 4th day, the accusations had stopped feeling personal. That was when I knew we were getting closer to the truth. When people are acting out of fear or anger, their moves are erratic. They overreach. They contradict themselves. But what I was seeing now was consistency, a steady tightening. Procedures invoked in the same order, the same language reused across different agencies, the same quiet pressure applied from multiple directions at once. This wasn't a family scrambling to protect their reputation. This was a system doing what it was designed to do. I spent the morning mapping connections on paper, the old-fashioned way. I wrote names in black ink and drew lines in red. Nonprofit boards, advisory councils, ethics panels, foundations that shared donors but claimed independence. On their own, none of it looked suspicious. Together, it formed a closed loop. I recognized the structure immediately. It was the kind of loop that allowed influence to circulate without ever appearing to move. By noon, I had identified the hub, a national nonprofit consortium that branded itself as an ethics watchdog. They didn't enforce rules directly. They advised. They issued guidance that boards and agencies treated like scripture because no one wanted to be seen ignoring it. My son's father-in-law sat on its executive council. So did two of the people who had signed off on my son's suspension. I leaned back in my chair and let that settle. If this had been a coincidence, I would have been disappointed. Coincidences were harder to dismantle. This was intention. I called the woman I'd spoken to the night before. "I need you to tell me everything," I said. "Not how it felt. What actually happened." She took a breath and began. Dates, meetings, a donor dinner she'd attended where she overheard a conversation she wasn't meant to hear, a request she'd refused because it violated reporting standards. The review that followed 2 weeks later, initiated without warning. "They said I was uncooperative," she told me, "that I didn't understand the bigger picture." That phrase made my jaw tighten. I'd heard it before. It was what people said when they expected obedience, not integrity. After we hung up, I pulled public tax filings for the consortium. I scanned donor lists and grant allocations. Nothing jumped out at first. Everything was technically clean. Technically was doing a lot of work. I noticed that several major donors also funded private consulting firms that specialized in reputation management and risk mitigation. Firms that were frequently contracted by nonprofits after ethics reviews. It wasn't bribery. It was monetized compliance. If you aligned yourself with the right guidance, your risks were mitigated. If you didn't, you became the example. That afternoon, my son received a letter from his former employer's legal counsel. It thanked him for his cooperation and reminded him that any attempt to contact donors or board members directly could be construed as retaliation. "They're telling me to stay quiet," he said, handing me the letter. "They're telling you they're afraid," I replied. He didn't look convinced. He still thought of them as untouchable, as institutions too large to be moved by one person's objection. That belief was part of why this worked. Lily came into my office later, carrying a notebook. "My teacher asked if I wanted to talk to the school social worker," she said. "She said it's okay if I'm scared." "Are you scared?" I asked. She thought about it. "I'm confused." "That makes sense," I said. "Confusion happens when adults lie." She nodded, satisfied with that explanation, and went back to her room. That night, I opened one of the old boxes I'd brought back from storage. Inside were binders labeled with years and program names. I hadn't kept them out of nostalgia. I'd kept them because I knew how often rules were rewritten without acknowledgement. In a binder from 12 years earlier, I found the original framework for the ethics advisory process the consortium now used. I recognized my own phrasing in it. I also recognized what had been removed. Safeguards, oversight triggers, requirements for independent review. They had streamlined the process. I cross-referenced the revision dates. The safeguards disappeared the same year my son's father-in-law joined the executive council. That was when I stopped thinking of him as an overreaching parent. He wasn't acting alone. I drafted a timeline, not of my son's case, but of the system's evolution. When certain language appeared, when accountability mechanisms vanished, when advisory opinions began carrying the weight of enforcement without the burden of proof. By the time I finished, it was after midnight. My phone buzzed again. This time, the message came from someone inside the consortium. "I can't talk on the record, but you're right." I didn't respond immediately. I waited until morning, then sent a single line, "Then help me prove it." The response came an hour later. They pre-select targets. Reviews are just the paperwork. I felt something cold settle in my chest. Pre-selection meant intent. It meant that outcomes weren't influenced by behavior, only by usefulness. I asked how they chose. People who won't play along, or who ask too many questions, or who don't belong. Don't belong. That phrase had many meanings, and none of them were neutral. Later that day, my son's wife showed up unannounced. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed, eyes darting past him into the house like she was already cataloging what she planned to take. "I need Lily's inhaler," she said. "The new one." "She has it," my son replied. "She needs it." "I'm her mother," she snapped. "I get to decide what she needs." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "You don't get to use medical equipment as leverage," I said. Her jaw tightened. "You don't get to interfere." "I get to protect my granddaughter," I replied. "And you should be careful what you mistake for interference." She stared at me for a long moment, then turned and left without another word. That evening, a new ethics notice was issued. This one expanded the scope of the investigation. More vague language, broader allegations. They were trying to exhaust us. Instead, they were leaving a trail. I sat at my desk and began organizing everything into a single file. Complaints, revisions, correspondence, testimony from the woman I'd spoken to, screenshots of overlapping board memberships. I didn't need to expose everything yet. I just needed to be ready. Somewhere inside that consortium, people were starting to realize I wasn't going away, that I wasn't reacting emotionally, that I wasn't asking for mercy or clarification. I was documenting, and documentation is dangerous to people who survive on silence. The custody notice arrived on a Friday afternoon, timed carefully to limit our options. It was filed as an emergency amendment, which meant it took effect immediately and wouldn't be reviewed by a judge until the following week. Temporary restrictions on visitation, supervised contact only, a requirement that all exchanges be coordinated through a third-party service to minimize emotional disruption. Emotional disruption, that was the phrase they used. My son read it 3 times before he spoke. "They're saying I can't see her alone. They're saying they want control," I replied. He nodded slowly, the weight of it settling into his shoulders. "They're using Lily." "Yes," I said, "and they're counting on you reacting." That evening, Lily sat on the living room floor doing homework, her inhaler placed neatly beside her notebook like a reminder. She'd started doing that without being told. I watched her for a moment, then sat beside her. "Has anyone asked you questions today?" She shrugged. "The counselor again. She asked if Daddy ever yells." "And what did you say?" "That he sings in the car," she replied. I smiled, but inside something hardened. Questions like that weren't meant to gather information. They were meant to plant doubt. Later that night, after Lily was asleep, I made another call. This one wasn't to a lawyer. It was to a child psychologist I'd worked with years earlier when a federal program needed guidance on trauma-informed evaluations. She remembered me immediately. "I need an independent assessment," I said. Quietly, thoroughly. She didn't ask why. We scheduled the first session for the next morning. When my son found out, he looked nervous. "Won't that make it look like there's a problem?" "No," I said. "It will make it look like we're prepared." The evaluation took place in my home office, with Lily sitting at a small table drawing while the psychologist asked questions that sounded like games. There was no clipboard, no leading language, just patience. I watched from the hallway as Lily talked about school, about her cat at her mother's house, about how she didn't like it when adults whispered and thought kids couldn't hear. "She notices everything," the psychologist said afterward, "including when people expect her to be afraid." "Is she?" I asked. "No," she replied. "She's confused, and she's resilient. That matters." I asked her to put everything in writing. She agreed. That afternoon, my son received a message from his wife. She wanted to talk. Against his better judgment, he agreed to meet her at a cafe halfway between our houses. I sat in my car across the street, watching through the window as they spoke. She leaned forward, her expression practiced, concerned, reasonable, the same expression she'd worn during charity events and holiday dinners. When he came back to the car, his face was pale. "She says this can all go away," he said. I waited. "She says if I admit I made a mistake. Just a statement, saying I misunderstood protocols, that I caused confusion. She says her father can make the ethics review disappear." "And Lily?" I asked. He swallowed. "She says full custody, but only if I step back. quietly. There it was. The trade. They're asking you to erase yourself, I said. He nodded. She said it's better than dragging Lily through this. I started the engine and pulled away from the curb. Dragging her through what? Through a fight, he said. Through the public part of it. I drove in silence for a few minutes, then spoke carefully. They already dragged her into it. They just did it quietly. That night, the psychologist sent me her preliminary notes. Clear, professional, direct. No signs of emotional instability. No indication of fear or distress caused by her father. In fact, it noted that Lily felt safer when routines were predictable and adults were honest. Predictable. Honest. Two qualities the other side couldn't afford. The next day, I received another email from inside the consortium. They're nervous. Custody cases draw attention. I responded with one word: good. That afternoon, a courier delivered a thick envelope addressed to my son. Inside was a formal offer of mediation, sponsored by the same nonprofit network overseeing his ethics review. It proposed a comprehensive settlement. Employment separation finalized, credentials voluntarily surrendered to preserve professional dignity. Custody transferred with generous visitation at the discretion of the primary household. The language was soft, reasonable, almost kind. At the bottom was a deadline: 48 hours. They're giving me a way out, my son said. They're giving themselves one, I replied. I spent the next day assembling what I'd been avoiding until now. Not evidence of wrongdoing, evidence of intent. I pulled records showing how often ethics complaints preceded custody disputes involving board members' families. How often professional allegations appeared days before divorce filings. How often the accused were advised to settle quietly for the sake of the children. Patterns don't lie, people do. By evening, I had what I needed. I called my son into my office and laid everything out on the desk. Not dramatically, not emotionally, just the facts. This is bigger than us, I said. They don't just want your compliance. They want precedent. He looked at the papers, then up at me. And if we fight? Then they lose control of the narrative, I said. And people like this survive on controlling narratives. He sat quietly for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Then we fight. That night, Lily knocked on my door. Are Mom and Dad mad at each other? She asked. Yes, I said honestly. Is it because of me? No, I said immediately. It's because of adults who don't like being told no. She considered that. I don't like that either. I smiled. Neither do I. As she walked back to her room, my phone buzzed again. They're planning something public. A reputation event. They think it'll pressure you. I stared at the message, then set the phone down. Public pressure worked both ways. And if they wanted to make this visible, I was more than ready to let them. The first file arrived just after midnight. It wasn't dramatic. No warning. No message attached. Just a compressed folder dropped into the secure inbox I hadn't used in years. I recognized the encryption signature immediately. Whoever sent it knew exactly who I was and how I worked. I didn't open it right away. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at my desk, and waited for my breathing to slow. Files like this weren't sent lightly. They were sent when someone had already decided there was no going back. When I finally opened it, I understood why. Inside were internal documents from the nonprofit consortium's ethics advisory arm. Drafts, not final versions. Working files with tracked changes still visible. Comments left in the margins by people who assumed no one outside their circle would ever see them. One document in particular made my stomach go still. It was labeled Case Selection Criteria, Internal Use Only. The language was careful but unmistakable. It outlined how individuals were flagged for heightened review, not based on misconduct, but on risk factors: refusal to comply with donor preferences, resistance to strategic alignment, failure to demonstrate institutional loyalty. My son's name appeared in a column titled Preliminary Concerns, dated 3 months before any allegation had been filed. 3 months. I scrolled further. There were email chains discussing timing considerations, notes about coordinating ethics reviews with related personal transitions, a suggestion that custody disputes created natural leverage points. I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. This wasn't corruption in the way people like to imagine it. There were no envelopes of cash, no whispered threats. This was cleaner, bureaucratic, designed to survive scrutiny because it hid behind process. I opened another file. This one was a metadata report. It showed document creation dates, edits, deletions. The ethics complaint against my son had been drafted, revised, and finalized before the incident it claimed to investigate had even occurred. They hadn't reacted to his behavior. They'd predicted it wouldn't matter. At 1:37 a.m., my phone buzzed. You see it now. I typed back a single question. How many? The response came slower this time. More than you'd want to know. I spent the rest of the night organizing the files. Not because I needed to understand them, but because I needed to preserve them exactly as they were. Originals, hash values, access logs, every detail intact. By morning, I had 3 redundant backups stored in 3 different locations. When my son woke up, I didn't tell him everything. Not yet. I told him enough. They decided you were a problem before you ever became one, I said. That's why nothing you say will fix this. Code. He rubbed his face with both hands. So it was never about what I did. No, I said. It was about what you wouldn't do. Later that day, Lily had her second session with the psychologist. This time, I sat in on part of it. Lily talked about how adults kept asking her if she was scared, and how that made her feel like she was supposed to be. I don't like when people want me to be sad, she said. It makes my chest hurt. The psychologist nodded. That's your body telling you something isn't right. When the session ended, she looked at me seriously. Someone is putting this child under unnecessary stress. It's not coming from her father. I know, I said. That afternoon, the public announcement came. The consortium released a statement promoting an upcoming National Ethics Summit to be held in 2 weeks. Panels, awards, keynote speakers, a celebration of transparency and accountability in leadership. 8. My son's father-in-law was listed as a featured honoree. They're going public, my son said quietly. Yes, I replied. They think visibility protects them. In a way, it often did. That evening, I received another call from the woman who had been pushed out years earlier. She sounded different this time, steadier. I spoke to someone else, she said. Another one. He lost custody of his kids after an ethics review. Same board, same language. Will he talk? I asked. Yes, she said. If you protect him. I thought about that for a moment. Tell him I don't protect people. I document the truth. That's better. He agreed. Over the next 3 days, more files came in. Testimony, correspondence, screenshots of internal chats, one message, sent during a late-night discussion between 2 board members, stood out. If we let him stay, others will think they can say no. That was the heart of it. Compliance through fear, silence enforced by example. By the end of the week, I had enough to expose not just one family, but an entire mechanism. But exposure wasn't the goal. Containment was. I sat at my desk and began drafting a report. Not an accusation, a narrative, a timeline that showed how ethics reviews were used to manufacture outcomes, how custody disputes were leveraged, how public-facing morality concealed private coercion. I addressed it to an independent federal oversight body that still existed in a form most people forgot about. It didn't move fast. It didn't issue press releases. But when it moved, it was thorough. Before I sent it, I hesitated. Once this went out, there would be no pulling back. My son would be scrutinized from every angle. Lily would be asked questions again. The quiet pressure would turn sharp. I called my son into my office. I need to know something, I said. Are you ready to have your life examined in ways you didn't choose? He didn't answer right away. He looked past me, toward the hallway where Lily's door was closed. They already did that, he said, without my consent. I nodded. I sent the report. 2 hours later, my secure line rang. "This is going to get complicated," a voice said. "Yes," I replied. "That's the point." Outside, the house was quiet. Lily was asleep. My son sat on the couch reading a book he hadn't turned a page of in 10 minutes. Somewhere else, people who had built their power on invisibility were starting to realize they'd been seen. And once something like that happens, it doesn't go back to hiding. The second man arrived on a Tuesday morning with nothing but a manila folder and a look that told me he'd rehearsed turning around more than once. He stood in my driveway for a full 30 seconds before knocking. When I opened the door, he didn't introduce himself. He just said, "I don't want my kids to know I was here." "That's fine," I replied. "Come in." He followed me into the office and sat on the edge of the chair like he might need to leave quickly. He was in his early 40s, neatly dressed, the kind of man who still believed professionalism could protect him if he did everything right. He slid the folder across the desk. "I was an internal auditor," he said, "for a regional nonprofit tied to the same consortium." I opened the folder. Inside were custody filings, ethics notices, email printouts. The first page alone was enough to make my breath slow. Same phrases, same structure, same timeline compression. "They said I accessed donor data improperly," he continued. "I didn't. They said they had concerns about my judgment as a parent. 2 weeks later, my ex filed for emergency custody. I didn't interrupt. They told me if I fought the ethics review, they'd recommend a psychological evaluation. They said it was for my children's well-being." He laughed quietly, without humor. "I signed the settlement." "What happened after?" I asked. "They closed the review," he said. "My credentials were quietly surrendered. The custody order stayed." I nodded once. "How many people were on the committee that reviewed your case?" He thought. 5. I turned my screen toward him and pulled up a document, a list of committee members from 3 different cases, his, the woman's, my son's. 4 names overlapped. He stared at it. "They told me it was independent," he said. "They always do," I replied. He leaned back, suddenly exhausted. "I thought I was alone." I was. "You weren't," I said. "You were early." After he left, I sat with the folder open in front of me. 3 cases now, different states, different nonprofits, same core group of decision makers, same outcome. This wasn't coincidence. It was infrastructure. That afternoon, the federal oversight body acknowledged receipt of my report. The message was brief and carefully worded, but it told me enough. They were opening a preliminary inquiry. That same afternoon, my son's wife sent another message. This time it wasn't conciliatory. It was sharp. She accused him of escalating the situation, of embarrassing her family, of forcing their hand. She warned that if he didn't accept mediation immediately, she would push for full custody, citing his inability to prioritize stability. My son showed it to me, his jaw tight. "They're getting scared," he said. "Yes," I replied. "That's when people make mistakes." End quote. That evening, Lily came home quieter than usual. She sat at the table and picked at her food. "My mom says you're doing this to hurt her," she said suddenly. I didn't react. "What do you think?" She shrugged. "I think adults lie when they don't want to say they're scared." I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something fierce rise in my chest. "You're very observant," I said. She smiled a little, then went to finish her homework. Later that night, the consortium announced a new panel for the Ethics Summit, a session titled Safeguarding Families in Leadership Transitions. My son's father-in-law was listed as a panelist. "They're using children as cover," my son said. "They always do," I replied. "It makes people stop asking questions." But questions were already being asked. The woman from the night before called me again. She'd spoken to 2 more former employees. One had lost access to his children for nearly a year. The other had been advised by counsel not to challenge the review for the sake of future employment. "Everyone says the same thing," she told me. "They thought it was just them." I sat at my desk and added 2 more names to the timeline. Patterns don't become undeniable all at once. They accumulate until denial becomes deliberate. At 10:18 p.m., my secure line rang again. "You've triggered internal panic," the voice said. "They're scrambling." "Good," I replied. "They're trying to clean files, reassign committees, distance people from prior decisions." "Too late," I said. "The versions are already saved." There was a pause. "You're going to burn all of this down." "No," I said calmly. "They did that themselves. I'm just making sure the fire is visible." When I hung up, I found my son sitting on the couch in the dark. "I don't know how you're so calm," he said. "I've seen this before," I replied. "Different faces, same structure." "What happens now?" he asked. I sat across from him. "Now we let them keep talking." 2 days later, the oversight body requested additional documentation: names, dates, custody case correlations. They asked questions that told me they'd already seen enough to know where this was heading. That same day, my son received notice that his ethics review had been temporarily paused pending external consultation. It wasn't a victory. It was a stall. They were buying time. That night, as Lily slept and the house went quiet, I reviewed everything one last time: the documents, the testimonies, the internal messages that revealed intent. One line stood out again, sharper than before: "If we let him stay, others will think they can say no." I closed the file. They had been right about one thing: others were watching, and soon they wouldn't be able to look away. They thought the pause meant they were regaining control. That was the mistake people like this always made. They confused delay with dominance. They assumed silence meant compliance, not preparation. The ethics summit moved forward as planned. Invitations went out. Press releases followed. Panels were confirmed. The language was polished, reassuring. Words like integrity and accountability were repeated until they lost meaning. My son's father-in-law began giving interviews. I watched one from my office, the volume turned low. He sat comfortably in a leather chair, speaking about the importance of transparency, about safeguarding institutions from internal threats. He used the phrase "difficult decisions" more than once. He never mentioned my son by name. That told me everything. My son didn't watch. He didn't need to. He was focused on Lily, on keeping her routine intact. Breakfast at the same time, homework at the same table, evenings quiet. Stability was the one thing the other side couldn't replicate. 3 days before the summit, I received an email marked confidential, counsel only. It came from the consortium's legal team. They were requesting a private meeting to clarify misunderstandings and avoid unnecessary escalation. They wanted to negotiate. I didn't respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to the oversight body and added it to the file. That afternoon, the man who had visited me earlier in the week sent a message. "They contacted me," he wrote. "Asked if I'd be willing to reconsider my statement. Offered consulting work." I stared at the screen for a moment. "Did you accept?" I asked. "No," he replied. "I'm tired of being quiet." That made 3 of them now. 3 people who'd decided silence cost more than speaking. The oversight body scheduled a closed-door review session for the morning of the summit. They didn't announce it publicly. They didn't need to. They requested attendance from select board members, including my son's father-in-law. He would find out the same way everyone else did. That evening, my son received a call from his wife. This time, she didn't pretend to be calm. "You did this," she said. "You and your mother." "We didn't fabricate anything," my son replied. "We documented it." "You're destroying my family," she snapped. "No," he said quietly. "Your family did that when they decided power mattered more than truth." She hung up without responding. Later that night, Lily came into my office carrying her notebook again. "I wrote something," she said. She handed it to me. Inside was a list. Things that are true. Dad reads to me every night. Grandma doesn't lie. Being quiet doesn't make bad things stop. I closed the notebook and hugged her. "You're right," I said. The night before the summit, I slept for the first time in days without waking. Not because I was relaxed, but because everything that could be done had already been done. The next morning, the city buzzed with anticipation. The summit venue filled with people in tailored suits and practiced smiles. Press cameras lined the entrance. Attendees greeted each other warmly, congratulating one another on being part of something important. Inside, the closed-door review began. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. By noon, word began to leak. The oversight body had requested original drafts of ethics complaints, not summaries, not explanations. Originals, metadata intact. They had asked why custody disputes appeared repeatedly alongside ethics reviews involving board members' families. They had asked about the case selection criteria document. The panel session on safeguarding families was delayed, then canceled. The official reason cited scheduling conflicts. By mid-afternoon, my son's father-in-law stopped answering calls. At 4:12 p.m., the consortium released a brief statement announcing that several board members were stepping back temporarily to allow for independent review. Stepping back was the phrase people used when they hoped time would soften consequences. At 5:03 p.m., my son received an email. His credentials were reinstated pending full review. No apology, no explanation, just restoration. He stared at the screen for a long time before speaking. "They're trying to contain it," he said. "Yes," I replied. "They're trying to make this look like an administrative hiccup. And will it work?" I shook my head. Not anymore. Because containment required silence, and silence was no longer available to them. That evening, as the summit continued without its keynote panelists, a reporter published a short article questioning the sudden changes. Nothing accusatory, just curious. The next morning, another article appeared. This one referenced unnamed sources and raised questions about ethics oversight processes being used as leverage in personal disputes. By afternoon, the story had a name: institutional coercion. My phone rang once more. "They're in damage control," the voice said. "They didn't expect witnesses." "No one ever does," I replied. That night, as Lily slept and my son finally allowed himself to breathe, I sat at my desk and reviewed one final document, a draft of testimony prepared for a federal inquiry that would soon become public. They had built their power on the assumption that people would choose survival over truth. They were about to learn what happens when survival includes speaking. The summit would be remembered for many things, but not for what they'd planned. The reckoning didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came in emails sent quietly before sunrise. At 6:18 a.m., my son's phone vibrated on the nightstand. He didn't wake up right away. Lily had climbed into his bed sometime after midnight, curling against him like she used to when she was younger. I saw the notification when I passed his room on my way to the kitchen. By the time he woke up, there were 6 messages waiting. 1 from the licensing board, 1 from his former employer, 2 from professional associations that had gone silent days earlier, 1 from a number he didn't recognize, and 1 from his wife. He read them slowly, sitting at the edge of the bed. "They want meetings," he said when he finally came into the kitchen. "All of them. They want to be on record reacting," I replied. The licensing board's message was carefully worded. The provisional suspension had been lifted. The review was now categorized as procedurally compromised. An external evaluator would be assigned. Procedurally compromised. That was the closest thing to an admission they were capable of. The employer's message followed the same pattern. They were re-evaluating recent actions. They emphasized that the termination was not a reflection of character and suggested a conversation about next steps. They wanted to rewind without acknowledging why the tape had been played in the first place. The unknown number was from a journalist. "I've been told you might have information," the message read. I didn't respond. Not yet. The message from my son's wife was longer than the rest combined. It shifted between anger and fear, accusation and regret. She blamed outside influence. She blamed pressure. She blamed misunderstanding. She did not take responsibility. She says her father didn't mean for it to go this far, my son said quietly. That's what happens when people lose control, I replied. They pretend the outcome surprised them. By mid-morning, the oversight body released a public notice. It didn't name names. It didn't outline findings. It announced the initiation of a formal inquiry into the use of ethics oversight mechanisms in connection with personal and familial disputes. The language was dry. The impact was not. Within an hour, the consortium's website went dark, not offline, just inaccessible. A temporary maintenance message replaced the homepage. They're hiding, my son said. They're reorganizing, I corrected. They think structure will save them. At noon, the journalist followed up. I'm running a piece this afternoon, the message read. I want to give you a chance to comment. I typed back a single line. The documents speak for themselves. That was all I needed to say. The article went live at 2:47 p.m. It didn't accuse. It laid out a sequence of events. Ethics complaints drafted before incidents. Custody filings timed to reviews. Repeated involvement of the same decision-makers across unrelated cases. It ended with a question. How often are ethics processes used to enforce silence rather than integrity? The comment section exploded within minutes. Professionals began sharing stories. Some anonymously, some not. Similar patterns, similar outcomes. Careers stalled. Custody threatened. Warnings delivered quietly. By evening, the phrase institutional coercion was trending in places that mattered. My son's father-in-law did not appear on television that night. Instead, his law firm released a statement, distancing itself from personal actions unrelated to firm values. That was the beginning of the end. At 7:30 p.m., my son received a call from his former employer's board chair. I want to apologize, the man said. We acted on information we believed was credible. My son listened, silent. We'd like to discuss reinstatement, the man continued. With compensation. And my name? My son asked. The man hesitated. What about it? My name was destroyed, my son said calmly. How do you plan to fix that? There was no answer. He ended the call without raising his voice. That night, Lily sat at the kitchen table coloring while the news played softly in the background. She didn't look up when the anchor mentioned the investigation. Grandma, she said, does this mean it's over? I thought about the question. It means the truth is louder now, I said. That's usually the beginning of the end. She nodded, satisfied. Later, after she went to bed, my phone rang. This time, it was the oversight body. We'll need formal testimony, the voice said. From all parties. When? I asked. Soon, they replied. Before this spreads further, if you haven't sided. I looked out the window at the quiet street, at the house that had become a shelter without trying to be one. They wanted this handled privately, the voice continued. They're losing that option. Yes, I said. That was inevitable. When I hung up, my son was standing in the doorway. Are we safe? He asked. Yes, I said without hesitation. They don't have leverage anymore. What about Lily? I met his eyes. They lost the moment they used her. Telfer Costum. The next morning, my son's credentials were fully restored. Not provisionally, not pending review, fully. A short notice appeared on the board's website citing irregularities in the initial process. The ethics complaint was formally withdrawn. No explanation, no apology, but the damage was already shifting. That afternoon, the journalist published a follow-up. This time, names were included. Board memberships, donor overlaps. The father-in-law's role was outlined carefully, with citations. The article ended with a sentence that made me close my laptop and sit back. Several sources confirmed that individuals who resisted compliance demands were identified months in advance and monitored for removal. They had been watched, selected. My phone buzzed again. They know it's over. I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because the collapse they feared wasn't coming from me anymore. It was coming from everyone who recognized themselves in the story and realized they were never alone. And once that realization takes hold, silence becomes impossible to enforce. The final truth surfaced the way most real crimes do, not with drama, but with paperwork. 3 days after the article broke, the oversight body issued formal subpoenas. They weren't flashy. They didn't announce them on television, but everyone who mattered received one. And everyone who received one understood exactly what it meant. My son's father-in-law was among them. So were 2 former committee chairs, a legal advisor who had rotated through 3 nonprofits in 5 years, and the director of the ethics advisory arm that had signed off on nearly every questionable review. They called it a scope expansion. I called it the moment they lost control. The documents the investigators requested weren't the ones people usually prepared for. Not public statements or final reports. They wanted internal communications, draft versions, archived calendars, donor correspondence, and private consulting agreements tied to risk mitigation services. That was where the truth lived. By the end of the week, the pattern was undeniable. The consortium hadn't just been enforcing ethics standards. It had been selling protection, not money in envelopes, influence, silence, stability. Donors who complied with preferred outcomes, hiring decisions, contract awards, quiet removals, received favorable advisory opinions. Their audits sailed through. Their reputations stayed intact. Those who refused were flagged as high risk. Ethics reviews followed, then custody disputes, then professional isolation. It was influence trafficking, disguised as governance. The oversight body didn't use that phrase publicly at first. They preferred something safer. Abuse of regulatory authority for personal and financial gain. My son read the summary twice before speaking. They didn't target me because I did something wrong, he said. They targeted me because I wouldn't do something wrong. Yes, I replied. And because they thought they could make you disappear quietly. They underestimated something fundamental. People notice when systems behave like predators. The first arrest didn't come from our case. It came from a donor complaint. A foundation executive, sensing the shift in power, disclosed that he'd been pressured to terminate a whistleblower in exchange for a favorable ethics ruling. He brought emails, contracts, invoices from a consulting firm tied directly to the consortium. That was enough. Within 48 hours, federal agents executed search warrants at 2 offices and 1 private residence. My son's father-in-law resigned from every board he sat on before noon that day. By evening, it didn't matter. The press didn't frame it as a scandal. They framed it as exposure. Articles stopped asking if misconduct occurred and started asking how long it had been happening. Former victims came forward, some with names, some without. Each story echoed the same structure, the same slow squeeze, the same warning delivered politely. Fight, and you'll lose everything. That threat had only worked because people believed they were alone. They weren't. My son's wife didn't call again. Her attorney did. He requested a private conversation about reassessing custody arrangements in light of new information. We'll reassess in court, I replied and ended the call. 2 days later, a judge granted an immediate modification restoring shared custody and removing all supervised conditions. The order cited material misrepresentation by third parties. My son didn't celebrate. He sat on the couch with Lily and watched a movie, her head on his shoulder, his arms steady around her. That was enough. The oversight body scheduled formal testimony for the following week. Closed session. No cameras. No audience. I went alone. I didn't speak emotionally. I didn't speculate. I laid out timelines, documents, metadata, and intent. I explained how systems like this evolve, how safeguards are quietly removed, how advisory language becomes enforcement without accountability. When I finished, one of the investigators looked at me for a long moment. "How long have you known this was happening?" he asked. "I suspected it years ago," I replied. "I didn't have proof until they used my family as leverage." He nodded slowly. "They made a mistake." "Yes," I said. "They forgot that people who build systems remember how to dismantle them." The official findings were released 2 weeks later. the consortium's ethics advisory arm was dissolved, its leadership barred from serving on non-profit boards for a minimum of 10 years. Several cases were referred for criminal prosecution. The phrase influence trafficking appeared in the final report. That was when the full collapse began. Organizations scrambled to distance themselves. Boards resigned en masse. Consulting contracts were terminated overnight. The structure that had once seemed untouchable folded inward under its own weight. My son received formal apologies from 3 institutions, written, signed, carefully phrased. He framed none of them. Instead, he accepted a position with an organization that had reached out quietly weeks earlier, one that valued integrity without requiring silence. On his first day, Lily walked him to the door. "Don't let them make you quiet again," she said. "I won't," he promised. One afternoon, as the house returned to something like normal, my phone buzzed one last time with a message from the same secure line that had started all of this. "They're finished." I set the phone down and looked out the window. This hadn't been revenge. It had been exposure. The kind that happens when power forgets that control only works as long as no one documents the truth. They had believed everything they built was solid. They had been wrong. And the final twist, the one they never anticipated, was that the system they weaponized was the very thing that ended them. Because systems remember, and when they are forced to confront themselves, they don't forgive. The quiet that followed was unfamiliar, not the uneasy quiet that comes after a storm when you're waiting to see what else will break, but a different kind, the kind that settles when something heavy has been lifted and your body hasn't caught up yet. For weeks, my son woke up early out of habit, bracing for another email, another demand, another accusation dressed up as procedure. Each morning, there was nothing, no new notices, no legal threats, no urgent messages with carefully neutral language. The absence itself took time to trust. Lily noticed it first. "They stopped asking questions," she said one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen counter doing homework. "No one pulled me out of class today." "That's good," I said. She nodded. "I think they got bored." I smiled, but I knew better. People like that didn't get bored. They got removed. The court hearing to formalize custody took place on a Wednesday morning. No press, no spectacle. Just a judge, 2 attorneys, and a thick file that spoke louder than anyone in the room. The judge didn't raise her voice when she addressed my son's wife. She didn't need to. She cited documented third-party interference, misuse of professional allegations, and emotional harm caused by unnecessary instability. She restored equal custody without conditions and issued a warning that further attempts to weaponize external institutions would result in sanctions. My son didn't look at his ex-wife when it was over. He looked at Lily. She squeezed his hand and smiled like someone who had finally stopped holding her breath. Afterward, we went out for lunch. Not to celebrate, exactly. Just to be together somewhere neutral, where the world felt ordinary again. Lily ordered pancakes in the middle of the afternoon because she could. "This is my favorite kind of day," she announced. "What kind is that?" my son asked. "The kind where nothing bad happens," she said. That night, after Lily went to bed, my son sat across from me at the dining table. "I keep thinking about how close it came," he said. "How easily they almost erased everything." "Yes," I replied. "That's why it works." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "It only works when people think it can't happen to them," I said. "You weren't careless. You were normal." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. "I don't think I want to go back to the life I had before," he said after a moment. "I wouldn't expect you to," I replied. "It was built on an illusion." He smiled faintly. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," I said. "But it's clearer now." The fallout continued quietly in the background. Boards dissolved. Policies were rewritten. Entire oversight processes were suspended pending review. The words transparency and accountability appeared everywhere again, but this time with caution attached. People had learned something. Not everyone, but enough. The journalist who had broken the story reached out once more, asking if I wanted to share a final comment for a follow-up piece. I declined. The story didn't need me anymore. It belonged to the people who recognized themselves in it. One afternoon, a letter arrived in the mail, handwritten, no return address. It was from the woman who had contacted me early on. "I'm back in my field," she wrote. "Not where I was before. Somewhere better. Thank you for not letting them keep me quiet forever." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where I kept things that mattered. A few days later, my son's former employer made a public announcement. They acknowledged procedural failures and committed to an independent review of all past ethics actions. They offered reinstatement to affected individuals and established a fund for those who had been harmed. It was a start. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Life didn't return to what it had been. It moved forward into something else. Lily adjusted first, as children often do when they're finally allowed to feel safe. She laughed more easily. She stopped sleeping with her inhaler beside her bed. One evening, she sat on the porch with me, watching the sunset. "Grandma," she said, "are bad people always bad?" I considered the question carefully. "Some people don't think of themselves as bad," I said. "They think of themselves as important." She thought about that. "That's worse." "Yes," I agreed. "It usually is." She leaned against my shoulder. "I'm glad you don't let people lie." I wrapped an arm around her. "I'm glad you know how to tell." Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I walked through the rooms slowly. The guest room was empty now. Lily slept in her own room again, her door open, light spilling into the hallway. My son's life was smaller in some ways, less impressive on paper, but it was honest. That mattered more. I sat at my desk one last time and closed the file I'd been building for months. Every document accounted for, every timeline complete. I didn't delete it. I archived it. Because systems don't stop being dangerous just because one mechanism collapses. They adapt, they rebrand, they wait. But now, there was a record, and records have a way of outliving power. As I turned off the light and headed upstairs, I felt something I hadn't felt since the night my son called from the hospital stairwell. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because the truth had survived being challenged, and that was enough. 6 months later, I drove past the hospital without realizing it at first. The building looked the same as it always had, glass reflecting the sky, cars circling the entrance, people moving in and out carrying worry they hadn't chosen. I recognized the stairwell through the side windows, the one where my son had sat on the floor with Lily asleep against his shoulder, apologizing to strangers for existing. I pulled over a block away and turned off the engine. Memory doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, like a place you didn't know you were still carrying. I sat there for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, and then drove on. There was nothing for me there anymore. Life had settled into a new rhythm, not the old one. That was gone for good. This one was slower, quieter, built with intention instead of assumption. My son worked for an organization that didn't ask him to trade integrity for access. He came home tired in a good way, the kind that comes from effort instead of fear. He laughed more. He slept through the night. Lily grew 3 inches and decided she wanted to learn how to play the guitar. She practiced every afternoon, fingers sore, determination written across her face. When she messed up, she laughed instead of freezing. Safety does that to children. One evening, she asked me if I'd ever been scared. "Yes," I told her. "Of what?" she asked. I thought about it. "Of being ignored." She nodded slowly. "That makes sense." She understood more than most adults ever would. The world didn't suddenly become fair. People didn't stop abusing power. Institutions didn't transform overnight into something pure and just. That was never how it worked. What changed was visibility. The oversight body released its final report that spring. It was longer than anyone expected and careful in its language, but unmistakable in its conclusions. Systems meant to enforce ethics had been used to silence dissent. Family relationships had been manipulated to apply pressure. Oversight had been replaced by loyalty. Several cases were referred for prosecution. Others were reopened. Some couldn't be undone. That was the hardest part. Knowing how many lives had been altered before the truth surfaced. But something else happened, too. Policies changed. Safeguards were restored. Independent review became mandatory where it hadn't been before. Transparency requirements were written back into frameworks that had quietly lost them. Not because people had suddenly become virtuous, but because they were afraid of being exposed again. Fear, when turned the right way, can be useful. The journalist who had first contacted me sent one last message. "You never asked for credit," he wrote. I didn't respond. Credit wasn't the point. One afternoon, Lily and I sat on the back steps watching the sun drop behind the trees. She was tuning her guitar, brow furrowed in concentration. "Grandma," she said, "do you think they'll try again?" "Someone will," I replied. "Someone always does." She looked up. "What do we do then?" I smiled. "We remember what we learned." "And what's that?" "That power hates witnesses," I said. "So we make sure there are always witnesses." She went back to tuning her guitar, satisfied. Later that night, after everyone was asleep, I opened the drawer where I kept the archived file. I didn't read it. I just checked that it was still there, that nothing had been lost. Then I closed the drawer and turned off the light. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast and leaves nothing behind. What I felt instead was something steadier: responsibility. People often think revenge stories end with punishment, with villains falling and heroes standing over the wreckage. But that isn't how real life works. Real endings are quieter. They look like children sleeping peacefully in their own beds, like jobs chosen freely instead of under threat, like systems forced to remember their purpose. What happened to my family wasn't unique. That's the part that should unsettle you. Abuse doesn't always leave bruises. Sometimes it leaves paperwork. Sometimes it leaves silence. Sometimes it leaves people apologizing for breathing too loudly in stairwells because they've been taught they don't belong. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: power doesn't disappear when you expose it. It changes shape. It looks for darker corners. It waits for people to stop paying attention. So don't. Ask questions. Keep records. Notice patterns. Protect your children not just from harm, but from systems that tell them harm is normal. And if someone ever tries to erase you quietly, remember this: they're counting on you believing you're alone. You're not. You never were. And the moment you stop disappearing, everything they thought was permanent starts to collapse.